While the Hollywood writers' strike has come to an end, the UAW strike continues to step on the gas. So when could it end? And is another industry about to step on the picket line? Several experts and analysts have weighed in on the disputes.
While Hollywood can breathe a sigh of relief after 146 days on the picket line, the Writers Guild of America has reached a tentative deal with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. The deal was reached after 5 consecutive days of negotiating. Picketing is suspended, but the writers will not go back to work until the strike is officially lifted. The vote for that is on Tuesday. While the full language of the new contract won't be available until it is fully ratified, it is expected that the studios met many of the writers' demands, including increases in royalty payments for streaming content and guarantees that artificial intelligence will not hurt writing credits or compensation. What impact can we expect this to have on streamers? Joining us now, we've got Geetha Ranganathan, who is the Bloomberg Intelligence Media Analyst here. Geetha, great to have you here with us this morning. So first and foremost, as we maybe are ready to finally turn the page on this part of the strikes, assuming that this is ratified here, what is the impact for the streamers here as you've been analyzing this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Brad, for having me. So yes, this is definitely a landmark agreement. Of course, it has to be ratified, as you just pointed out. But I think this has, major positive implications for the media ecosystem at large, because remember, with these strikes, both the writer strikes as well as the actor strikes, production in Hollywood had come to a complete standstill, and that was creating a lot of overhang for some of these media stocks, because we didn't know when production was going to resume, and it kind of looked like the content pipeline was getting a little thin and was almost maybe drying up as we kind of get into 2024. From a streamer perspective, they really haven't seen a huge disruption. If you think of a company like a Netflix or even an Amazon Prime or even Disney Plus, they haven't seen a huge disruption just yet. And that's because they have like this huge library. They have a lot of archival content that they can kind of draw upon to keep, to get new subscribers, to keep their existing subscribers engaged. But the real hit has been felt by TV network owners, right? Broadcast TV network owners, where, daytime talk shows, where late night comedy shows have kind of come to a complete halt. And we've also seen kind of a disruption in the fall TV schedule. So, this is definitely good news for media companies at large, for TV network owners first, and then for streamers also, because obviously their content has also come to a complete production. And this now kind of sets the stage for writing to pick up in the next few weeks' time as kind of the deal is ratified. And so production schedules should kind of normalize into 2024.
Geetha, what about the financial impact here for the studios? Like we were just saying, we don't know exactly what is going to be in this agreement, but just judging by the language that the union used, it's likely we're going to see better pay, better residuals, AI-related protection. So when you look at that financial impact here for the studios, how are you gauging that, or what is your best guess just in terms of the potential hit that they could take from the higher pay?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be material. I think if they didn't get a deal in place, that would have been far more detrimental to the studios and to the media network owners, because, we just a few weeks ago, in fact, we had Warner Brothers kind of come out with revised earnings expectations, which they kind of took down. They said that because of the lack of new content, they were going to kind of see a 500 million EBITDA hit in 2023. So the thing is, as the strikes kind of dragged on, and if they kind of dragged into 2024, obviously it would have had a huge impact on the bottom line for 2024 as well. Yes, definitely they are going to have to pay more in terms of compensation, in terms of benefits, in terms of residuals. But again, remember, it's not going to be a huge impact, because we kind of did some math around this. In fact, the WGA had also put out some numbers regarding what they expected companies to pay. And if you looked at kind of Netflix and Disney, it was less than about 100 million a year. So nothing too onerous for the studios. I think really what the sticking point was probably the use of AI and kind of putting guardrails around that, so that the writers' work is protected, so that it doesn't cut into their income, it doesn't make them lose control over their work. And I think it looks like they've kind of achieved what they wanted.
And so from what we know right now, the writers have now been instructed to abandon the picket lines, but also to go to support the actors and the Actors Guild. So how much more pressure now does that put on negotiation talks there?
Yeah, so I think the formal deal with the WGA has to be ratified. That'll probably take a week or two. But I think this definitely, it is now kind of incumbent on the studios, I think, to kind of capitalize on on this momentum. Now that they've got the writers' strike kind of ironed out, it's kind of incumbent on them to do the same with the actors as well, and kind of get production back on track, both for films, for TV shows. So I think this definitely kind of gives them some momentum and probably some leverage as well in getting the actors back to the negotiating table.
What's good? Sorry, Geetha, can you repeat that last point just in terms of the leverage that you think that's going to give the actors, you said, or on the studio side?
I think it gives the studios some leverage now that they've gotten this deal done. I think they can really push for the actors to kind of come back to the negotiating table and get them going so that production kind of resumes across the board.
So, Geetha, what do you think the timeline looks like on that? Is this a strike that you think is going to be resolved here within the next week or two, given that pressure that we're likely to see?
Yeah, I think, most people initially had thought, I mean, the writer's strike had kind of turned out to be one of the longer strikes, right? The longest strike was in 1988, 35 years ago, which was over 154 days. This one just came in about a week shorter. So obviously they've been striking for a really long time, but it looks like it's kind of worked out for them. But yes, it does definitely put pressure. And I think that this will bring kind of the actors also back to the table. Initially, we were expecting this to kind of go into 2024, but it looks like right now, by the end of October, I think as long as they can get the actors union back to the table and negotiate, I think we might see normalized production or kind of resume by the end of October, which is good news definitely for both studios and TV production houses.
Well, Hollywood writers have reached a tentative deal with studios after 146 days on the picket line. They may be able to finally hang up their signs. Now, the deal is expected to be ratified within the next week or two. Then the studios will have to work to do with the Actors Guild. Now, SAG-AFTRA tweeted following the WGA news saying, quote, "We look forward to reviewing the terms of the WGA and AMPTP's tentative agreement, and we remain ready to resume our own negotiations with the AMPTP as soon as they're prepared to engage on our proposals in a meaningful way." Well, joining me now for the latest on this is Alex Weprin, media and business writer for The Hollywood Reporter. Good to have you on the show, Alex. So at least some welcome relief here at this point. What do we know about what this means in terms of the shows that we can expect to come back online and start production?
Well, Rochelle, the first shows that are going to come back are the late night shows. They've been dark since the writers went on strike back in May. Those should come back online in the next couple weeks or so. Depends on when they can get staffs to the office. The thing with a lot of the other scripted movies and TV shows, though, is that those really can't resume production until SAG-AFTRA has a new deal as well. And so that's why I think there's going to be a big push to try and resolve the strike with SAG-AFTRA, because the clock is ticking right now for the holidays. So I think that there's going to be a big push to kind of resolve that strike. And until they do, most scripted film and television is still going to be shut down.
So then in terms of some of obviously there's overlapping issues with the WGA that SAG-AFTRA has, but what are some of the more complex ones which are going to hold up production getting back on track?
There are a couple of issues this time around that just didn't exist before. There were some like, pay raises and increased residuals. Those are obvious. Those are things I think everyone is expecting to deal with. But the role of artificial intelligence in film and television creation, that's a whole new problem for them to solve. And so the specific language around how they can use AI, that's been a sticking point for the writers. They did come to a solution. We don't know what the specific details are, but they seem to come to an agreement. That's going to be a sticking point with the actors as well, who are really worried about, virtual actors or AI-generated actors being used in film and television production. So that's a sticking point. And then the other big sticking point is, streaming. When this deal was ratified, SAG-AFTRA, the last deal, streaming was a thing, but it's now become the dominant place for scripted film and TV, and they believe that they should be paid commensurate with what they were getting paid for their linear television programs. That wasn't the case. And so these two new technologies, streaming and AI, those are kind of the big sticking points.
Because it really does come to really future-proofing the industry. As you mentioned, a lot of things just weren't on the radar when a lot of these original deals were negotiated. And I do want to bring up something that you mentioned, which is about the timing, because you were saying in your notes that and the importance of reaching a deal before Thanksgiving. Otherwise, we could see these strikes go into 2024. What sort of domino effect, then, does that mean for production and even being able to get some of these shows out?
Yeah, I mean, look, let's say that SAG and the studios resume talks at some point this week, maybe later this week. Then you're talking about a couple of weeks to negotiate a deal at best, and then it'll take a couple of weeks for it to get ratified. SAG is a very big union. There's over 100,000 members. And at that point, you're just about at Thanksgiving. And between Thanksgiving and Christmas, that's when Hollywood usually shuts down. So, at that point, most productions probably won't be able to get up and running until 2024. Maybe there'll be a push to kind of get some up and running in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. But, at that point, it's going to have a major impact on the bottom line, especially for the linear television channels, which won't really have new shows until later in the spring. So there really is a sprint here to get a deal done, I think. And the sooner they can get one going, the sooner they can get these shows back on the air, and the sooner that the companies that own these channels and streaming services can kind of reverse their financial fortunes.
And Alex, we know that some shows, including The View, still went ahead with non-union workers while the strike was ongoing. If the strike does continue and they still haven't really reached an agreement there, what does that mean for perhaps some more of these shows getting to a breaking point where they do decide to take on non-union workers just so they're not like bleeding billions of dollars here?
Yeah, so I mean, look, the daytime talk shows and the late night shows, they all use WGA writers. The hosts are covered under a different SAG contract. They're not actually on strike right now. I do think that'll actually allow at the end of the writer strike will allow them to return to production fully because they'll be able to bring back their WGA writers. So that'll return those shows to work. I think you're less likely to see non-union workers in scripted film and TV. That's the contract that SAG is on strike against right now. And so that's an issue where I don't think the studios are going to lean into to non-SAG actors. I think that's too risky for everybody involved. I think they're just going to really push for a new deal with the union.
And so, Alex, if you had to give your best case scenario at this point, given that they are still quite far apart on some of the issues when it comes to SAG-AFTRA, what would the best case scenario look like from here?
The best case scenario is that SAG-AFTRA takes a look at the WGA deal and says, you know what, this is pretty good. And they kind of structure their own deal around the WGA's deal. If they did that, they might be able to come to an agreement pretty quickly. It's just there are some SAG specific issues that they're going to have to work through. But if they really kind of like what the WGA has, maybe they can get a deal done in a week or less than 2 weeks. And in that case, they might be able to try and expedite, the ratification of the deal and get production up and running as soon as possible.
And as you mentioned, the clock is definitely ticking there. Appreciate you getting us up to speed. Alex Wehrprint, media and business writer for The Hollywood Reporter. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rochelle.
As the United Auto Workers strike heats up, spreading to 38 locations in 20 different states, Detroit is becoming the unofficial site of the Biden-Trump rematch. Now, President Biden is heading to Michigan Tuesday with plans to join the UAW picket line. Then, former President Trump will deliver remarks at an automotive supplier on Wednesday. Joining us now to give us a better view of where things stand, we want to bring Greg Migliori. He's Autoblog editor-in-chief. Greg, it's good to talk to you. So just give us a sense of where negotiations stand this Monday morning, because we were talking about Friday how the expanded strike against GM and Stellantis, but the UAW talking about some of the progress that they have made in talks with Ford. So where are we today?
Hey, good morning, guys. So I think as it stands right now, the Detroit Three and the union are pretty far apart in the negotiations. I think Ford is a little bit ahead. When the union expanded their strike on Friday, they didn't actually include any Ford facilities. They just expanded to General Motors and Stellantis parts distribution centers. So it appears there's a little bit of progress on the Ford front. And of course, they did reach a deal on the Canadian side. North of the border there, they were able to get a deal done with Unifor. So there's a little bit of progress going on the Ford side, but it does seem like, generally speaking, they're pretty far apart on major issues like wages, increases, bringing back perhaps some defined pensions. There's definitely some big sticking points that they need to iron out.
And what's the pass-through to auto vehicle prices here from your estimation and from your analysis, Greg?
Sure. So, I mean, right now, obviously, there's probably not any immediate impact. If labor costs increase, that can always change the calculus when it comes to the price of, new cars. But it's also just one element. There's a lot of different things that go into the cost of a new vehicle. So that's a little hard to say. You look at things like tax benefits, management, salaries. All of those things go into the price of, the price of new cars.
Greg, when it comes to the timeline of this, I think everyone's trying to figure out exactly how long this is likely going to drag on for. And then, of course, the financial hit that we could see not only for these automakers, but also so many of the suppliers that are affected by this strike. Do you have any gauges in terms of what that timeline could look like?
It's interesting because in some ways the strike is historic. It's unprecedented. Never has the union struck all three automakers at once. So you kind of wonder, well, how long could this really go on? I think it could be weeks. It could be months even. I think it's one of those things where there will be a tipping point where at some point I think the union will want to try to get a deal done because, with a number of workers not working, that certainly does, that's a financial hit for the workers and their pockets, that sort of thing. So I think at some point the pressure will start to tip. That being said, I think UAW President Shawn Fain has done a masterful job of sort of winning the public relations battle right now. He's been able to sort of sense the moment in this country with like the writers' strike on the West Coast and, President Biden, of course, in the Oval Office, who is an unabashed, union person. And he's been able to leverage that into trying to, outright reject, some of the deals, the offers right now that in the past would have been probably pretty good deals. What he's trying to do, I think, is flip the field and try to bring things back where, the union does have a stronger say in things like battery plants, where EV factories are built. And I think what he's sensing is this is the time to do it. There may not be a better time.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly did see Shawn Fain kind of morph from one of the earlier press conferences where he showed up wearing a technical fabric golf shirt into late last week's press conference where he was wearing camo. He still had the short sleeve cut. But at the end of the day, he was someone who knew he had leverage and negotiating power. And that might also proceed into who the UAW decides to endorse. We do know that Biden's going to visit. We know that Trump, former President Trump, is also going to make a visit as well here to Michigan. So all that considered, how does this also play a larger role perhaps in 2024 and what each campaign may be saying about the matters that affect the UAW?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's going to be a very historic, interesting week here in Michigan, that's for sure. You have two presidents, coming to essentially support the workers. It sounds like President Biden may actually be on or near a picket line at an actual factory, whereas former President Trump will be at more of like a supplier, perhaps in the suburbs. That's what we know right now. So perhaps a little bit farther away from an actual picket line. But regardless, they both want the blue collar vote in 2024. I think it's definitely going to be a big part of their reelection strategy. Michigan and many Midwestern states are traditionally swing states. So, the votes of these workers could very easily swing the election next year.
Greg, when we talk a lot about the impact of this strike and what it could mean down the road, there's obviously a big focal point on the transition to EVs and what that could do just in terms of their ability to continue to meet some of the lofty goals that the Detroit 3 automakers have laid out and how this could, I guess, potentially disrupt that timeline. How are you looking at that? And I guess how big of an impact do you see some of these potential agreements, if we do see that, what that means then for the automakers' EV transition process?
So I think right now with the UAW, the big part, and this is really important, I think, as part of the negotiations, is they want to have a seat at the table for the EV transition. They want to be able to have access to unionized new factories that, may be making the batteries, that may be making the EVs themselves. They want a seat at the table for that. And I think if they get that, in some ways that changes the narrative, because right now, former President Trump has been able to sort of cast EVs as something that some things are being like maybe rammed down the throat by President Biden and that they think maybe it's not good for workers. If you look at it another way, if part of this contract, the union gets access to build these vehicles, which they are doing today. Every Detroit 3 plant is unionized and every factory in the United States that builds EVs is currently unionized. So from the American companies. So I think that's a big part of these negotiations. It's a little tricky too, because a lot of the battery factories are from companies that, are joint ventures with perhaps overseas companies. So what I think is critical for the union is to get access to things like the battery factories to try to unionize those.
Well, the ongoing battle between automakers and the United Auto Workers Union is in focus today after expanding its strike to 38 parts and distribution centers of both Stellantis and GM. And our next guest is laying out reasons why she says automakers need to step up. Carla Walters, Center for American Progress Senior Director of Employment, joins me now. Thank you for joining me this morning. So, Carla, talk about the ways that you think some of these companies should be stepping up right now.
Yeah, so we have seen that the big three, GM, Stellantis, and Ford, really failed to put forward a contract or contract proposals that demonstrate that they respect their workers and support a just transition to electric vehicles. We have seen CEO profits and pay and company profits really climb over the last several years. And meanwhile, workers are being asked to do more with less. Workers on the picket line are saying our jobs used to be the gold standard for the working class, and we want to see that again. So now they are asking for several measures to make that such, to make sure that they're being rewarded for the wealth they help create. And we are seeing some positive signs. We're seeing the announcement that President Biden will be visiting the picket lines this week, and as the UAW has ramped up its striking activity against GM and Stellantis, they've announced that they are in productive negotiations with Ford and have decided to not ramp up their activity there. So they're continuing to strike against just one facility at Ford. So as we see this play out, we'll really be watching for, can those productive talks with Ford and hopefully with the other automakers become more productive, and can we see resolution? And ultimately, if Ford gets to resolution first, what we will expect is that to put pressure on the other automakers.
So to that point then, what does this mean in terms of leverage? Now that the strikes have expanded, but you also have some of these more positive and productive negotiations going on with Ford, what does this do in terms of leverage between these two sides?
I think what we're seeing is, I think we're really in this moment right now where we're seeing workers in motion across the economy, across different sectors, and our labor market being tighter so that workers have more leverage, and pushing for more than they've had in several years. And these workers have been living under the conditions of the last recession for far too long. We saw in the negotiations of 2008, where the federal government stepped in to bail out the big three auto workers or automakers. Auto workers step in and say, we will take concessions in order to save these companies from the brink of bankruptcy. These conditions are really in the rearview mirror for CEOs and for the companies in terms of profits, profitability, and pay. But for workers, they're still continuing to live under this, and they're hoping that they have leverage in this moment and pushing their relative power in this moment to demand an end to a two-tier wage system that put too many workers in a position where they're earning barely enough to get by, an increase in cost of living agreements, better support for their retirees, so that they can continue to then push from this moment of relative strength for a return to these better working conditions.
And you raise a good point, because obviously some of this is catching up from the bailout, as you mentioned there, and then also, of course, with COVID as well. But then also when it comes to companies looking at future-proofing, the investments that they're making with electric vehicles and automation as well. What does this mean then for what the future of the auto labor industry looks like, when we still don't even know just how advanced some of these things can be, and already these negotiations are so tense?
Yeah, we're really at this critical moment in the industry where we're not just looking at labor negotiations, but we're looking at a push towards what does the future mean in terms of electric vehicles. And really, we see two things happening at once here. We see maybe three things. We see automakers really making investments here. We see the federal government investing in these companies, saying that we want to make sure we remain competitive as a sector. And we see workers saying, hey, we're a part of the sector too, and we deserve to be rewarded for the wealth we help create. And ultimately, we need to be able to see for the future strength of this industry, for our ability to ensure that this industry continues to be a robust sector that helps support a middle out growth strategy through our economy. We really need to see all those things work together at once to support good jobs and support our domestic production.
And Carla, a lot of people wondering where things go from here. Ford saying on Sunday that there are still significant gaps to close in the negotiations, and this is the company that they're having the productive talks with. What is the worst case scenario as this continues then?
Well, I mean, I think we obviously want to get to resolution here in an expedient manner. Workers' livelihoods are on the line, and we know that UAW is preparing to ensure that is both at negotiating and at the table, but also saying we're going to back up our workers. We're going to make sure our strike fund is strong enough to withstand a longer duration strike. But ultimately, we need the automakers to come to the table and negotiate in good faith. The lack of good contract proposals from them got us here in the first place. So really, it's about now, how can they step up and make offers to workers that are going to be meaningful?
We'll certainly continue to track that. We appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning. Carla Walter, Center for American Progress, Senior Director of Employment. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
President Biden is on way to walk with striking workers today. President Trump is going to address them tomorrow. How would you resolve this strike? First of all, would you get involved? Second of all, do you think the auto workers deserve the additional pay and job security and benefits that they are asking for?
Well, first, let me say, I was governor of Indiana, and Indiana is the second leading manufacturing state in the country per capita. We got an awful lot of auto workers in the state, and they're just great men and women, part of a great tradition. But I got to tell you, I think what's driving that UAW strike is not the standard arguments over class warfare and disparity between income and wages. I think it's that the fact is, under Bidenomics, wages are not keeping up with inflation. And American auto workers know that, they're feeling it. And secondly, and just as important, the Green New Deal buried in that so-called Inflation Reduction Act is waging war on people that manufacture combustion engine automobiles, which last time I checked is most of what they manufacture in Detroit. I mean, I think any auto worker paying attention, and they all do, has got to understand that Bidenomics has failed to protect their paychecks, and also that this drive toward mandating and subsidizing electric vehicles, the batteries for which are mostly made in China, many of those cars will be manufactured in China, and those factories are being built outside of Michigan. Those auto workers, I think, are stepping up. And when Joe Biden makes it to that picket line, I would encourage any UAW workers looking on to pull them aside and say, hey, can we undo this Green New Deal that's poised to shut down gasoline-powered vehicles all over this country in the next 10 to 15 years? And but at the end of the day, too, I would tell you, I'm someone that believes in right to work. I believe people ought to be able to choose whether they join a union or don't join a union. Michigan just went backwards on right to work. They repealed the right to work legislation that they passed, and I really do believe that the pathway forward for prosperity in manufacturing, including the automotive industry, is to create a more competitive environment, have right to work. Let's get beyond this Green New Deal electric vehicle mandate and subsidies, and let's bring policies that will really get wages rising in the country.
So, Vice President, I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. So you think that the strike right now by the UAW workers, that it is justified?
Well, look, I think that 74% of Americans that are frustrated with the economy under Joe Biden, I think that sentiment is very justified. Wages have not been keeping up with inflation, despite all the happy talk coming out of Washington, D.C., and working Americans know it. Now, I'll leave to the workers and negotiators and to the company to sort out, what changes could be made. I know there's negotiations underway. I'm a free market conservative. I believe those things ought to be settled in the free market. If I was president, I'd certainly encourage the dialogue. But I'd also go to the root causes of this, which is the fact that runaway inflation is undermining wages in this country, and this electric vehicle mandate and these subsidies are undermining combustion engine manufacturing of automobiles in this country, and auto workers know it.
Auto Workers Union confirming to Yahoo Finance that it will indeed expand its strike once again if no major progress is made in negotiations. The walkout has become highly politicized, with President Joe Biden making an unprecedented move to join the picket line yesterday, and his Republican rival, Donald Trump, set to make a speech to auto workers this evening, and he's also been slamming the EV industry. Joining us now is Tom Narayan from RBC Capital. Tom, it is good to see you. We've been trying to sort of parse this out and the effect that this is continuing to have on the automakers. But listen, let's dive right into the politics of it, because I think a lot of people are struggling to understand the dynamics at play here. A lot of fingers being pointed at EVs and some of the incentives being given to that industry. In your mind, how much is that is sort of the culprit for the squeezed margins of the automakers, which maybe then are leading them to this negotiation with the workers? How are you thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this, we have to put everything in context. There is some degree of political theater here, right? You have both sides that don't really want to cave in. UAW coming in with a very unprecedented high demand, right? A 40% increase in labor costs. And then the OEMs, they have a situation they're facing, which is coming off really high price mix that's probably going to start normalizing. So that is going to pressure their profitability. They definitely don't want to pay higher wages on top of that. They have given in to as much as 20% wage increase. The UAW wants a lot more. So it's definitely a hot topic. I'm sure it's getting a lot of attention. I do think ultimately a resolution will happen, just like it did in 2019. We're in the midst of it, right? It's only been 2 weeks. So there's going to be a lot of discussion in the media and the press about it. But ultimately, we do think it'll get resolved.
And Tom, as you noted, this is getting a lot of attention, including getting the attention of Elon Musk. And he warned that the UAW demands, Tom, could drive Ford, GM, Stellantis to bankruptcy. I'm sure you saw this. He posted on X, they want a 40% pay raise, a 32-hour work week, surefire way, he says, to drive GM, Ford, and Chrysler bankrupt in the fast lane. Let me get your response to that, Tom. Is Musk right?
No, I think that's some I don't know for another way to say it, but that's a lot of Elon speak. I think it's definitely not positive, right, for the auto industry to have 30 or 40% or whatever wage increases. But we actually run the math on this thanks to Ford that provided some data. Labor costs is actually only about 3% of sales. So if wages or labor costs increased by 20%, it would only be about a 70 basis point hit to operating income. If it's a 30% increase, which we think might ultimately be what happens, it's only about 100 basis point margin impact. So if you're an 8% margin company, it drops to about 7%. So these companies are not going to go out of business by any means. They have really rich balance sheets. They went through the pandemic and made a lot of money. They don't want to pay more, but they can survive this. So I think this.
Come on, Tom. We want some drama. We need the sky to be falling. Come on. I'm also curious. Since some of this is performative, some of it is politics, not just on the part of an Elon Musk or actual politicians, but on the part of the union, on the part of the people running the automakers. What if a lot has been made not just of what the workers make, but what executives make also? I mean, what if Mary Barra comes out tomorrow and says, fine, I'll take a 25% pay cut? She still obviously would be making a lot of money. I mean, is there any chance in hell that something like that could happen?
No, I don't think so. And I think people realize, right? I mean, all of our pays is based on a free market, right? I mean, the reason why she makes what she makes is because that's what she's worth, right? You could put a CEO in the wrong CEO in that job, and we could lose a lot of people's jobs, right? So ultimately, I mean, look how much money Elon Musk has made for Tesla, right? If I can say something positive about him, right? It's put $800 billion worth, right? So him alone is worth them not needing to advertise because he tweets and that creates marketing value for the company, right? So like a CEO is worth a lot at the end of the day. I think this is, yeah, it comes into the political theater debate. I mean, ultimately, she's worth every penny that her shareholders think that she's worth.
And Tom, let me also get your ratings on some of these names. Correct me if I'm wrong, my friend, but I think you got an outperform or the equivalent of a buy on GM and Stellantis, but a sector perform, equivalent of a hold on Ford. Why basically a hold on Ford, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, it's a relative basis, right? I mean, I think GM is an interesting story here. They're really taking advantage of the IRA. They have a ton of EVs are about to hit, Lyriq, Celestiq, Blazer, Equinox. You got the Silverado, the Hummer, really are hitting the stride right now. The stock is also down like 25% in the past 3 weeks because of UAW, which I think is a little bit of a head fake. I think it goes away. And they're really going to take advantage of the IRA with all of their facilities they're building. Stellantis, I think they're catering to the U.S. market. Maybe they could potentially list in the U.S. 100%. So it's just a valuation disconnect there. It's very cheap relative to high margins. Ford, I think it's just on a relative basis. I think they're figuring out their footing with EVs. Ford Pro is an awesome, amazing business. I think electrification, maybe Lightning and Mach-E maybe a little bit stale. So they're just figuring out the footing there. So it's really on a relative basis versus GM and Stellantis.
And Tom, finally, I also want to ask you about China, but specifically Chinese-made parts that go into some of these U.S. electric vehicles. As you know, there has been a debate in the White House about how to sort of classify these various vehicles, how much of foreign-made parts can go into them. From what I understand, this would, if it was all U.S., Ford would be at a bit of a disadvantage. Can you talk us through how you're factoring that in?
Yeah, sure. That's a great point. Obviously the facility that they delayed the construction on, it's a partnership with CATL. It's LFP facility, I believe. And so, yeah, CATL is Chinese. So obviously there's some pushback there. But I do have to say, like, Ford ultimately, remember, their main business is Pro, which is not, electrification is not as critical for the professional business. It's, florists and plumbers and these sorts of folks who buy these products. So ultimately, I think their decision to delay the construction there, I think is more of a function of where they are in their footing. GM, on the other hand, has the similar facilities they're building in a JV with LG, which is Korean and doesn't have those types of restrictions. But they're really pushing forward with electrification. So while, yeah, certainly this, the CATL partnership for Ford is having an impact now, apparently, ultimately, I don't think it's as critically bad for Ford, given that their really motivating factor is the professional business, which we don't really need electrification as aggressively. And GM is pursuing it with LG, where they don't have these types of restrictions.
We're hearing now from UAW President Shawn Fain as he is announcing even more of the moves that are set to come and are being announced by the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union. We heard from Shawn Fain just last Friday, and so now in a weekly cadence here, we've heard more of the updates. As of right now, they have heard and they have been working day and night, Shawn Fain saying, to bargain a record contract. Ford and GM have refused to make meaningful progress, he says, and they said that they're also going to expand the strike to Ford and GM from noon today here. Particularly interesting as we were continuing to listen into some of the early comments that Fain was making at the start of today as well. He said that the war on workers is a rigged fight for decades. It's been the same story: unchecked corporate power, disappearing worker power. The result is massive inequality across our society to restore the balance of power, and saying that they have to restore the strike. That's what every one of their striking members is doing. So they are continuing to move forward with the announcement of this. You're taking a look at some of the reaction to shares in real time on some of these announcements as well.
Yeah, certainly another strike beginning at a Chicago plan for Ford and also at a Lansing, Michigan plan here for GM. In terms of the expansion that we're looking at now, UAW is saying that they're calling on an additional 7,000 Ford and GM members to strike starting at noon today. And when just before Sean Fain started speaking, he was a little bit late, and he said that that was because they made last-minute progress with Stellantis. You can note here that they are not expanding their strike against Stellantis, at least for now. And this comes, Brad, like you were saying, after some of the progress that UAW had said that they had seen with Ford, at least last week, because remember, Ford was spared in terms of the expansion of the strike that we saw when the UAW had 5,600 workers at 38 GM and Stellantis owned parts distribution centers in 20 states begin to strike and walk off the job just about a week ago. And this is a strike that began back on September 15th when nearly 13,000 auto workers walked out and stopped working at the big three assembly plants in Michigan, in Missouri, and in Ohio. So still, they have not reached a deal with the big three automakers. And as a result of that, even though they have said that they had made significant progress in the talks with Stellantis, we're seeing the strikes continue against the big three and expand when it comes to their strikes with GM and Ford.
Just kind of describing the setting here that we've continued to watch Sean Fain really navigate through, and for the members that he's representing, some of them feeling so encouraged or at least so motivated as to create a music video, it seems, from one of the members that was started and really kicked off today's press briefing, or not even a press briefing, just really a presidential briefing from UAW President Sean Fain, who last week was wearing camo in a short sleeve shirt. This week, as one of our esteemed kind of viewers has also mentioned, looks more akin to Jake from State Farm. All that considered, you've got considerable movement forward here. At least it seems. Stellantis, as we were taking a look at shares, that is one of the only companies that is holding on to gains right now. And here's why. As you were discussing earlier, they have made additional progress there at Stellantis, not calling on any additional members at Stellantis to strike. And so perhaps there is a little bit of movement that's taking place, but you wonder what Stellantis is negotiating, how they're negotiating differently than Ford and GM right now. Ford and GM still, those shares in the red as of this point in time, and this press briefing continues to go on right now, or this announcement of any updates continues to go on right now.
And we will, of course, we'll keep you updated with any additional headlines coming out from Sean Fain of the UAW.
The UAW is expanding its strike to 2 additional plants this morning. The union specifically going after Ford and General Motors, with 7,000 additional workers set to walk off the job in the next hour. Stellantis was spared this time, though, with UAW President Sean Fain saying the car maker has made, in his words, significant progress on key issues. 3 weeks into the strike, the economic impact is starting to ripple beyond the big three and the auto space. Let's bring in Wedbush Managing Director and Senior Equity Analyst Dan Ives with a breakdown here. Dan, I'm looking at the stock moves of the big three and not a whole lot of movement on the back of the latest announcement here. How big of a hit is this, or does this intensify in any way compared to where we've been the last 2 weeks?
Well, look, I mean, this is, if you looked up in the dictionary debacle, there'd be the UAW strike. That's what you'd see right now. And I think for the street, it's not about the next quarter or two. It's about what this does to the EV strategy. And I think this is just, it's which poison do you pick, right? Because if they accept this deal, GM, Ford, I mean, I believe this would significantly impair their EV strategy for decades to come. So that's why right now they're going to continue to fight this in this cage match versus UAW and FAN.
Let's look at some of the sticking points here. We start with the benefits, specifically looking at what that means from a cost perspective. We got reports yesterday that the UAW has come down from its initial request of a pay increase of more than 40%, but we're still looking at roughly 30, maybe in the high 20s, where they want it to be. What does that mean from a cost perspective of an EV to the consumer?
Yeah, because ultimately the consumer is going to have to pay this. I mean, it's going to get passed down, right? And I think if you look at the current deal, we think $3,000 to $5,000 per vehicle. That would be the incremental cost. If you go down to call it mid-20s, that's something that's maybe digestible, where, you know, we're talking $1,000, $1,500. But look, this is the big issue here is foreign automakers, and especially Tesla. I think right now Tesla is champagne on ice, because this was going to be the lingering competition that's gone after Tesla. And I think the frustration is to watch someone like Mary and the team build this brick by brick for years to get to this point. Now the torpedo hits their strategy.
Do they scale back their strategy as a result? I mean, let's take that argument you just made, $1,000 additional if the car makers are able to move things in their direction. I mean, we're still talking about cars out there like a Kia, Tesla, that already have a cost benefit because they are selling at a cheaper price point. You add in the government incentives into that. Does that prompt the big three to say, look, maybe we need to scale back our ambitions so at least from a cost perspective, we can still compete in the market?
I disagree. I mean, to that point, I know someone raised it. They have to dive into deep end of the pool on EVs. I mean, this is the future. This is when you look at how GM's built everything from Ultium and the battery technology. I mean, they've built what I view as potentially a transformative strategy in Detroit. I think Farley obviously has gotten Ford in the right direction as well. They cannot take a step back here. I mean, that's why right now, this is going to be a heavyweight boxing match because they understand that is going to be the strategy. But the UAW, they're going to have to play ball in terms of some negotiation here to get a deal done. Otherwise, this is going to be a long and nasty few months.
What does it mean from an adoption standpoint? Does this change the timeline at all? Do consumers essentially just go where the market is, where the prices are lower, even with this strike in place? In other words, if they were looking at a GM or Ford, prices go higher, let's say, do they just sort of switch over to a Tesla or a Kia or a Volkswagen?
Well, that's the biggest worry because once, if you, or whoever, their first EV, no different than an iPhone. I mean, the chances that they're going to stay within that sort of company and, from a buying behavior decision is pretty high. The biggest worry here is that the longer the strike goes on, this goes on 4 weeks plus 6 weeks, it's an absolute Friday the 13th, a nightmare on Elm Street, because then the EV strategy for 2024 really then at that point starts to move out, potentially 3-6 months. They've missed a window. That's why right now this is all like watching a slow moving car crash.
And that movement still continuing here with the UAW once again expanding that strike today. Wedbush Managing Director and Senior Equity Analyst Dan Ives, as always, thanks so much for joining us.